They humiliated him in front of 200 guests. At his own son's wedding, Thomas Grayson, a quiet, retired teacher, was reduced to nothing by the bride's cruel toast. With a smile sharp enough to cut glass, Vanessa thanked him for showing up since he couldn't contribute financially. The room laughed politely. The band kept playing, and Thomas stood frozen, every sacrifice he had ever made crushed in a single moment. He said nothing, but the silence was not surrender. It was a fuse quietly burning. What came next, no one at that wedding would ever forget. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. 6 months before the wedding, Thomas Grayson had been standing in the cramped office of a downtown law firm staring at a set of papers that looked more like a cruel prank than a legal document. The attorney, a man with rimless glasses and a voice too calm for the weight of what he was saying, repeated the number as if Thomas might not have heard it the first time. $83 million. His late brother Henry, who had lived a life of quiet distance and unexpected success in oil and land investments, had left it all to him. Thomas remembered Henry as the older sibling who once fixed his bike chain on a hot July afternoon, not as a man who would die with a fortune that could buy entire neighborhoods. Thomas signed the documents with a steady hand but an unsettled mind. Outside, the sun burned down on the city pavement, but he barely noticed the heat. He drove home in his battered Ford pickup, the one with the dent in the fender from a grocery store parking lot 2 winters ago. The truck groaned along the road, smelling faintly of oil and dust, carrying him back to his modest 3-bedroom home on Maple Drive. Every mile he drove, the number echoed in his head, not as a blessing, but as a burden. Inside the house, nothing had changed. The creak in the hallway floorboard, the faded recliner by the window, the photos of Daniel as a boy taped into frames that had never been replaced. He set the legal folder on the kitchen table and poured himself black coffee. He didn't drink champagne to celebrate, didn't call anyone to share the news. He sat in silence looking at the stack of bills, the half-finished crossword, and the chipped mug in his hand. $83 million, and he still felt like the same man who had scraped by on a teacher's salary. For weeks the inheritance remained a secret buried inside him. At the grocery store he clipped coupons. At the gas station he paid in cash. When the neighbor asked about the truck sputtering in the cold mornings, he laughed and said it was too stubborn to quit. The money hadn't touched him, not really. But the thought of it gnawed at him at night. He would lie awake staring at the ceiling fan, imagining how quickly Daniel and Vanessa might circle like vultures if they knew. He loved his son, but he knew love wasn't immune to greed. He tested himself walking through car dealerships and luxury showrooms, standing before gleaming chrome and polished marble. He could buy 10 of everything he saw. He could move into a mansion with rooms he would never use, kitchens that smelled of imported wood and stone. Yet he walked out every time driving his old Ford home, heart pounding with the knowledge that none of it mattered. He wasn't afraid of temptation. He was afraid of what temptation might reveal in others. One evening, he found himself standing on the porch as the summer air cooled, listening to the crickets sing. He thought of Henry again, the brother who had chosen solitude, who had never trusted anyone enough to share his fortune while alive. Perhaps Henry had known what Thomas was only beginning to understand, that money was not freedom, but a mirror. It showed people who they truly were, and sometimes the reflection was ugly. Daniel called the next morning, his voice quick, distracted, filled with plans about the wedding. Vanessa had visions of grandeur. He said visions that required money. Thomas did not offer. He asked about contributions with a tone too careful to be casual, pressing for details without quite demanding. Thomas felt the weight of silence pressing against him. He wanted to tell his son he could pay for it all, that he could build a palace if needed. But something inside him, some raw instinct sharpened by years of watching teenagers test boundaries, stopped him. Instead, he answered simply that he would be there, nothing more. That night he sat at his kitchen table again, papers spread before him. The inheritance was untouched, in accounts and trust numbers glowing on a screen that seemed more like fiction than reality. He scribbled notes on a pad, planning quietly, not for extravagance but for strategy. He began to test the people around him. When a neighbor asked if he needed help fixing the broken porch railing, he declined and repaired it himself, watching how people treated him when they assumed he was still the same man with calloused hands and a teacher's pension. He let his truck smoke on the road, let the paint peel on the shutters, let Vanessa's eyes flicker with disdain when she looked at his shoes. Each insult, each sigh, each glance that dismissed him, he tucked away like evidence in a trial. He was building a case, though no one else knew it. On weekends, he drove out to the lake where he and his late wife once walked hand in hand. The water shimmered calm and endless, reminding him that money could never replace what he truly wanted back. He would sit on the dock, jeans rolled up, notebook in his lap, writing lines only he would ever read. Plans, reminders, warnings. He thought of Daniel's laugh as a boy, how it used to echo through these woods, and wondered when it had hardened into something quieter, something less trusting. The fortune became less of a gift and more of a weapon resting in his hands. A quiet weapon, unseen but sharp, waiting for the right moment. He didn't want to use it to destroy. He wanted to use it to reveal. When Vanessa suggested a dinner with her parents at a high-end restaurant, Thomas knew what was coming. He dressed plainly, the same brown jacket he had worn for years, the one with a fraying cuff. The hostess barely glanced at him when he walked in, but Vanessa's parents gave him the kind of smile that didn't touch their eyes. He ordered a steak cooked medium, a glass of water. Their laughter was soft, but he heard it. Gregory Brooks made a comment about old habits. Elaine asked if he had ever traveled beyond the state, as though the idea was laughable. Thomas smiled politely, but inside the ledger of insults grew longer. He drove home afterward in silence, the truck engine grumbling like an old dog, his reflection in the windshield calm, steady. He told himself again what Henry must have known all along. Money changes nothing about who you are, but it changes everything about who others believe you are. And so he waited. He waited through every dinner, every phone call, every half-hidden sneer and careless word. He waited with the patience of a man who had taught hundreds of restless teenagers, a man who knew that silence could be louder than rage. Each day drew him closer to the moment he would finally open the door and let the truth come crashing in. What no one at that wedding knew was that the quiet old man sitting in the corner wasn't poor, wasn't powerless, and wasn't finished. The bride's polished smile and the family's superior looks were fuel on a fire already burning. And when the time came, Thomas Grayson was ready to turn that fire loose. Thomas knew masks better than most. For years he had taught history to teenagers who pretended to understand when they didn't, who hid fear behind jokes and arrogance. Now he wore one of his own, not out of shame, but out of strategy. The inheritance sat untouched in accounts larger than most banks, but to the outside world he was still the weary old man who lived on a pension that barely covered groceries. He leaned on a cane when he left the house, let the pickup backfire at stoplights, and carried coupons in his shirt pocket for all to see. It was a performance, and every performance had an audience. The first test came at Daniel and Vanessa's apartment. Vanessa had chosen a place in one of those luxury complexes on the edge of downtown, all glass and steel, with a concierge at the desk and a gym no one used. Thomas walked into the lobby, his cane tapping lightly on the polished floor, his shoulders bent as if weighed down by the years. The concierge barely looked up, but Vanessa's eyes flickered as soon as she saw him. That flicker was all Thomas needed. It wasn't recognition, it was calculation. Dinner was roast chicken with sides arranged neatly on white plates that probably cost more than the entire set in Thomas's kitchen. Vanessa spoke in the polished tone of someone used to curating every sentence. She asked about his finances with a sweetness too sharp, dropping hints about how expensive weddings could be, how her parents had already sacrificed so much. Thomas chewed slowly, nodding, offering vague replies about his pension, about the rising cost of utilities, about how sometimes he skipped repairs because money was tight. She didn't disguise the way her smile thinned. Daniel said, little sipping wine avoiding his father's eyes. After dinner, Vanessa cleared the plates but left his empty glass untouched. Her parents, Gregory and Elaine, arrived with dessert, a grand show of imported tiramisu, and a bottle of champagne. Gregory slapped Daniel on the back, told him how proud he was, and glanced at Thomas with the expression of a man humoring an inconvenience. Elaine offered a polite comment about how people of his generation knew how to live simply. Thomas thanked her, letting the cane rest against the table where it caught the light. When he left that night, he let the truck rattle louder than usual, the muffler growling like an animal in pain. Vanessa stood at the window watching. He knew what she was seeing, a burden, not a prize. The test was working. In the weeks that followed, Thomas sharpened his act. He walked slower at gatherings, allowed himself to be treated like background noise, always present but never commanding. At a bridal fitting, when asked to sit and wait, he endured whispers from Vanessa's friends about how sweet it was that Daniel still cared for his dad, even though he had so little to offer. He wrote every word down later in a notebook, neat lines of evidence no one else knew existed. At a brunch hosted by Vanessa's family, he listened as Gregory spoke about investments, boasting about stock portfolios and beach property in Florida. Gregory asked Thomas if he'd ever considered selling his old place and moving into a retirement community. Thomas chuckled softly, replying that he couldn't dream of affording something like that. Vanessa's laugh was too quick a slip that revealed more than she intended. Daniel looked at his plate, silent again. There were moments when Thomas almost broke character. Once at a hardware store, he caught sight of a leather armchair, the kind that would have fit perfectly in his study. He had the means to buy 10 of them without a dent in his fortune, but he walked past, pushing his cart with the squeaky wheel, letting the act consume him. Every sacrifice to the performance was fuel for the fire he was building. The cane became more than a prop. He used it to measure people. At a family dinner, Vanessa grabbed it abruptly to move it out of her way, muttering that it was always in the wrong spot. At another, Elaine leaned over sweetly and asked if he needed help cutting his steak. The smile on her lips never reached her eyes. Daniel was harder to read. Sometimes his son looked at him with a flicker of doubt, as if he suspected more than Thomas admitted. But then Vanessa would squeeze Daniel's hand, whisper something in his ear, and the doubt would vanish. Thomas told himself the real test wasn't just for her, it was for his son as well. One afternoon, Vanessa insisted on driving him across town to a bridal vendor. He sat in the passenger seat, cane across his lap, watching her talk on the phone, switching between sugary charm and sharp irritation. When traffic slowed, she sighed dramatically, complaining about how exhausting it was to plan a wedding on a shoestring budget. Thomas glanced at her perfectly manicured nails, the designer bag tossed carelessly on the back seat, and said nothing. A block later, she nearly clipped another car, then turned to him with narrowed eyes. If he hadn't distracted her with his cane, she said it wouldn't have happened. The words were quick, reflexive, cruel. He pressed his lips together, looking out the window, filing the moment away. That night he wrote in his notebook again, the pages filling with neat, deliberate script. Every slight, every insult, every dismissal, they weren't wounds. They were clues. Clues to who Vanessa was when she thought no one was watching, when she believed she had already won. Thomas spent evenings alone at his kitchen table, light from a single lamp casting shadows across the room. He looked at the photo of his late wife, her smile frozen in time, and wondered what she would say. She had always been able to read people, always warned him that Daniel's heart was too soft for the kind of world Vanessa came from. He whispered to the photo that he was preparing, that patience was his weapon, and that when the time came, the mask would drop for everyone to see. The disguise had become second nature. The cane tapped out a rhythm of deception. The old truck carried him like a stagecoach in a play no one else realized was unfolding. And as the wedding drew closer, he understood something vital. He wasn't just testing Vanessa. He was testing his own son, testing whether blood was stronger than greed, whether love could survive the shine of false promises. What none of them knew was that the man they pitied, the man they dismissed, was keeping score. And when the score was finally revealed, it wouldn't just change the wedding. It would change everything. The evening air was thick with the smell of overwatered roses and polished leather when Thomas stepped through the door of the Brooks estate. The house wasn't a home. It was a stage built for admiration, with chandeliers blazing like a row of suns and portraits of ancestors he doubted anyone in the family truly cared about. Gregory Brooks greeted him with a handshake that lingered too long, the grip firm but the eyes cold. Elaine followed with a delicate tilt of her head. A smile stretched tight as though she had practiced it in the mirror for moments just like this. Vanessa fluttered in every movement, rehearsed, and kissed Thomas lightly on the cheek before leading him toward a dining room that looked like it belonged in a presidential palace. Daniel walked behind her, not ahead, his eyes already lowered as though preparing himself for something unpleasant. The long mahogany table glowed beneath a dozen candles, silver, polished to a blinding shine. Every place setting looked like it cost more than Thomas's truck. He lowered himself into the chair at the far end, cane balanced carefully against his leg. Gregory poured wine with a flourish, offering notes about its vintage, how it had cost a small fortune at an auction in Napa. Thomas nodded politely, sipping water instead. Elaine tilted her head, complimenting him for knowing his limits, her tone light, but her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone slipping a knife between the ribs. When the meal began, Vanessa guided the conversation with the smoothness of a conductor. She asked Thomas what he wanted to order. He chose steak medium, nothing elaborate. Her laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "Classic," she said, glancing at her parents. "He always sticks with what's safe." Gregory chuckled, raising his glass in agreement. Daniel shifted in his seat but said nothing. The food arrived on oversized plates, arranged more like art than sustenance. Elaine leaned forward, her diamond bracelet catching the candlelight. "You must find traveling difficult these days," she said sweetly. "All those stairs in airports, the long walks. It's no wonder older gentlemen prefer to stay close to home." Thomas cut his steak with deliberate calm, the blade scraping softly against porcelain. "I manage," he answered, the words clipped sharp. But Vanessa's laugh filled the pause, polished and rehearsed, echoing through the vaulted ceiling like an accusation. As the courses passed, so did the cruelties. Gregory asked if Thomas had considered selling his house, moving into something manageable like a retirement community. Elaine praised him for keeping things simple in a way that made simplicity sound like failure. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, eyes glinting, and remarked that Daniel's friends often marveled at how different their backgrounds were, how remarkable it was that Daniel had risen so far. Every word was coated in sugar, but the bitterness seeped through. Thomas chewed slowly, each bite harder to swallow than the last. He thought of all the nights he had worked double shifts, the years he spent paying for Daniel's education, the mortgage payments made with calloused hands and sleepless eyes. Now here he was, a guest in a house dripping with wealth, treated like a relic too stubborn to disappear. What cut deepest was not their words but his son's silence. Daniel sat rigid, smiling politely when expected, never lifting his voice to shield his father from the blows. Thomas studied him across the table, searching for the boy he had raised, the one who once swore he would stand by his father no matter what. But that boy was nowhere to be found. In his place sat a man afraid of breaking the polished illusion his fiancée and her parents had created. Dessert arrived, some delicate French creation Thomas couldn't name. He didn't touch it. Instead, he folded his napkin carefully, laid it across the plate, and looked at Vanessa. She smiled like a queen, certain of her throne, convinced she had already won. Gregory poured another round of wine. Elaine asked a shallow question about the weather, and Daniel kept staring into his glass. The humiliation pressed down on Thomas, heavy as stone. He felt it in his chest, sharp and suffocating. But beneath it, deeper, colder, something else stirred. He met Vanessa's gaze across the table, and for the first time that evening he allowed the mask to slip, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel a flicker of unease. Her smile faltered for the briefest second. That was all he needed. When the evening finally ended, Thomas stood leaning on his cane with deliberate slowness. He thanked them politely, his voice steady, even warm. He let them think they had diminished him, let them believe the act. But as he walked out into the cool night air, the weight of their laughter trailing behind him, he knew the performance was nearly over. In the quiet of his truck engine rumbling, he sat with his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. The pain wasn't just theirs to give. It was his to shape, to transform into something sharper, something lasting. And as he drove back into the dark headlights cutting through the silence, he already knew the next test would reveal more than Vanessa or her family could ever prepare for. The Brooks estate looked less like a home and more like a carefully staged museum, every surface gleaming as if polished for a royal visit. Thomas stepped inside and felt the weight of its grandeur pressing on him, not because he was impressed, but because he understood exactly what it was meant to do, remind him of where he did not belong. Gregory Brooks welcomed him with the handshake of a man closing a deal, firm enough to assert dominance but empty of warmth. Elaine followed with a smile as delicate and false as porcelain. Vanessa hovered between them like a jewel, proudly displayed, her arm hooked through Daniel's, as though her possession of him needed to be announced. The dining room was a cavern of polished mahogany, gold-rimmed china, and crystal glasses that sparkled under the chandeliers. Thomas set his cane carefully by his chair, a prop that felt heavier tonight. The first strike came quickly. Elaine, with her syrupy voice, noted how refreshing it was that Thomas preferred water over wine, remarking how wise it was for someone his age to know his limits. Gregory chuckled, the sound dry as paper. Daniel's fork scraped his plate, but he said nothing. When Thomas ordered steak medium, Vanessa tilted her head with a mocking smile. "Classic," she said, her voice bright enough to draw laughter from her parents. "He always stays with what's safe." The jab was soft on the surface, but Thomas felt the edge of the blade beneath. He cut his steak deliberately, the knife whispering across porcelain, and raised a bite to his lips as though the insult hadn't touched him. The cruelties multiplied, each one wrapped in politeness. Gregory asked if Thomas had ever considered selling his home, perhaps moving into a community better suited for him. Elaine leaned forward, bracelets sparkling in the candlelight, and mused about how difficult traveling must be with his cane, how airports must feel impossible. Vanessa laughed when her mother said it, a laugh rehearsed and hollow, a laugh designed to reduce. Thomas listened, his face calm, but each word was carved into his memory. Every smirk, every glance, every insinuation that he was less. What wounded most deeply wasn't their contempt, it was Daniel's silence. His son sat at that gleaming table, nodding politely, sipping wine, never once raising his voice to shield his father. That silence was a wound deeper than any insult Vanessa could craft. Dessert was placed before him, delicate and untouched. Thomas folded his napkin neatly and laid it across the plate, his movements measured. Vanessa's smile widened, triumphant, as though the night had confirmed what she already believed, that she had reduced him to a relic. But when Thomas met her eyes, he let a shadow of the mask slip, just enough for her to see a glint of steel beneath the meek exterior. Her smile faltered for the briefest second, and that crack was all he needed. Later, in the solitude of his truck, he sat gripping the wheel, the humiliation burning cold inside him. He had endured every barb, every insult, every calculated cruelty, not because he was powerless, but because he was patient. They thought the evening had diminished him. They thought the act was real. But as the engine rumbled and he drove into the dark, Thomas knew the performance was drawing to a close, and the next step would reveal truths that none of them were ready to face. Thomas sat at his kitchen table late into the night, the small velvet box resting before him like a living memory. Inside lay the diamond ring that had once graced Margaret's hand, a ring modest in size but monumental in meaning. For 40 years it had symbolized their endurance, their partnership, their quiet victories over hardship. He turned it gently between his fingers, the stone catching the faint glow of the lamp, and in that fragile light he saw not just jewelry but the life he had built and lost. Giving it away felt like tearing a piece of himself free, but he believed it could become a bridge. Perhaps he thought Vanessa might see its value not in carrots, but in love. At dinner the next evening he waited until conversation lulled. He placed the box on the table between them. Vanessa's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth in a performance of awe. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered as she opened it, letting the stone sparkle in the chandelier's glow. "How beautiful." Thank you." Her words dripped with sugar, her expression perfect for the watching eyes of Daniel and her parents. Even Daniel looked relieved, as if believing for a moment that peace was possible. But later, when the dishes were cleared and laughter had faded into polite murmurs, Vanessa leaned close. Her voice dropped to a hiss only Thomas could hear. "It's sweet," she said, her smile frozen for the crowd. "But let's be honest, it's junk. A few $100 at best." She snapped the box shut, slipped it into her purse, and raised her glass to toast something shallow, leaving Thomas frozen in silence. His chest tightened, the sting cutting deeper than any insult before. Margaret's memory reduced to a trinket. 40 years of devotion dismissed with a single smirk. He didn't speak. Instead, his hand slid into his pocket, fingers brushing the small recorder he had switched on when dinner began. Every word had been captured, every note of contempt preserved. He sat back, his face calm, his posture unbroken. If Vanessa thought her whisper would vanish into the night, she was wrong. Driving home, the weight of the empty passenger seat gnawed at him. He remembered Margaret's hand on the wheel, her laughter when their old car broke down on a back road, her faith when money was tight. That ring had been their promise, their anchor, and now it had been spat upon by someone who didn't know sacrifice from vanity. Sadness welled, but beneath it something colder solidified. Resolve. In his study he played the recording back, her voice clear, sharp, undeniable. He sat in the dark, listening again and again until the pain dulled into something else, a plan forming in the quiet. Vanessa had shown her true self not just to him, but to the device that remembered more faithfully than any human. The ring was gone, but her words had become a weapon sharper than any jewel could ever be. Thomas folded the recorder into his coat pocket and stared at the photo of Margaret on the mantel. "She doesn't know," he murmured to the empty room. "But she will." The house settled into silence, but in his heart the night was alive with purpose. The bridge he had tried to build had been burned not by his hand but by hers. And in the ashes Thomas saw the first outlines of the path he would take next. Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a fountain pen scratching across lined paper, his hand steady despite the storm building inside him. He wrote the names slowly, almost ceremonially. Each one carried a lifetime of meaning. Mr. Parker, the neighbor who once fixed his fence after a storm ripped it down. Ellen Ramirez, the school secretary who never forgot his birthday. Harold, the retired plumber who came in the dead of winter to fix a burst pipe and refused to take payment beyond a handshake. Men and women who had walked beside him through decades of ordinary struggles and small victories. These were the people who had shaped his life not with wealth or power, but with loyalty. He folded the list carefully and slipped it into an envelope, knowing it might be the most personal contribution he could make to his son's wedding. The next evening, he handed the envelope to Vanessa across the glossy marble counter of her apartment's kitchen. She tore it open with manicured fingers, eyes scanning the names as if they were numbers in a ledger. For a moment, her face was unreadable. Then her lips curled. "This is it?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "A neighbor, some retired teachers, a plumber?" She tossed the paper lightly onto the counter as though it carried no weight at all. "Thomas, this isn't a backyard barbecue. We're talking about a $100,000 wedding. These people aren't suitable." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas stood silent, the cane resting against his leg, his face unreadable. His eyes, though, betrayed the fire stirring beneath. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her, glancing at his father, then at Vanessa. He cleared his throat. "Maybe we could find a place for a few of them," he muttered weakly. Vanessa's laugh was a dagger wrapped in velvet. "Darling, be serious. You want Instagram pictures with a plumber in the background. This is the most important day of our lives. It has to be perfect." She picked up the list again, flicked it between her fingers, and let it flutter back down to the counter, as though it were trash. Thomas felt the sting deeper than he expected. Those names were not just names. They were his history, his anchor, the people who had shown up when no one else did. To Vanessa, they were blemishes on a curated photograph. To Daniel, they were barely worth defending. He stared at his son, searching for resistance, for a glimmer of the boy who used to run barefoot across the yard, who once promised to take care of him when he grew old. But Daniel's eyes slid away, his silence louder than any insult. The rest of the evening blurred. Vanessa spoke of flower arrangements and seating charts. Gregory called about securing a jazz trio. Elaine emailed photos of possible menu options. Thomas sat at the edge of it all, listening as though through glass, invisible in a room filled with opulence. Every laugh, every word about perfection drove the blade deeper. His friends had been erased in seconds, dismissed with a curl of Vanessa's lip. Driving home, the truck groaned against the night air. Thomas gripped the wheel tight, the list folded in his pocket, like a wound he couldn't stop pressing. He thought of Ellen, who once brought soup when his wife was bedridden with pneumonia. He thought of Harold, who crawled under his house in freezing water just to stop a flood. He thought of Mr. Parker, who shared tomatoes from his garden every summer without asking for anything in return. These were the people who had made his life whole. And now, with a single sneer, Vanessa had declared them unworthy. Back at his kitchen table, he unfolded the list again, running his fingers across each name as though touching the past. Betrayal was no longer just theoretical. It was here in ink and disdain. He pulled out his notebook, the one already filling with observations and slights, and began to write. Vanessa rejected them all. Daniel silent. Community erased. He wrote the words slowly, deliberately, as though carving them into stone. His late wife's photograph stared back at him from the shelf, her eyes kind, her smile eternal. He whispered into the silence, telling her what had happened, telling her that the people who once filled their home with laughter and casseroles and unpolished love had been stripped away for the sake of an image. He waited for an answer he knew would never come. The room felt colder. But beneath the ache, something harder began to take shape. Vanessa's sneer had not destroyed him. It had clarified him. If she believed loyalty, friendship, and shared history meant nothing, then she was about to learn what it meant to have none of those things when the ground shifted beneath her. He folded the list one last time, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into his notebook. It would not be thrown away. It would be kept as evidence, another piece of a puzzle that was nearly complete. And as he leaned back in his chair, staring into the shadows of the quiet house, he realized this wasn't just about a guest list. It was about erasure of his life, his worth, his very existence. The silence of his son was worse than the sneer of his bride-to-be. But silence could be broken. And Thomas was beginning to plan exactly how loud his voice would become when the moment finally arrived. The city streets were slick with a thin mist that turned every light into a smear of color as Vanessa's luxury sedan glided through traffic. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, cane across his lap, his body angled slightly toward the window. He kept his expression neutral, but his hand tightened on the leather grip of the cane every time Vanessa pressed harder on the accelerator. Her phone buzzed on the console screen, flashing with a string of messages, but she didn't silence it. She laughed at something on the screen, glanced down, and for a split second her eyes weren't on the road. The car drifted toward the dividing line, a horn blaring as another driver swerved to avoid them. Tires screeched, rubber burned, and the sedan jolted back into its lane. Thomas braced himself against the door, heart pounding, the smell of scorched rubber lingering in the air. Vanessa's knuckles whitened on the wheel, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she turned sharply toward him, her voice like glass breaking. Really? Thomas, could you keep that cane out of the way? It's distracting. You nearly made me lose control. He looked at her, his face unreadable. The cane had been resting quietly on his lap, untouched. The lie was so brazen, so effortless, that it almost made him laugh. But he didn't laugh. He let the silence stretch the weight of her accusation, filling the space between them. Her eyes darted back to the road, lips pressed thin, as though she believed the blame could be shifted with a single sentence. Moments later, her tone softened, dripping with false concern. Are you all right? That must have been scary for you. I really do worry about you getting around, especially with that cane. Maybe we should find safer ways for you to get to these fittings. You shouldn't have to deal with all this stress at your age." The hypocrisy was almost unbearable. Thomas adjusted the recorder in his pocket with the quietest of movements, making sure it caught every word. The tape would remember what she thought was forgettable. He glanced at her hands gripping the wheel, perfectly manicured, tapping impatiently against the leather, as though she couldn't wait to be done with the inconvenience of his presence. They drove past rows of storefronts and neon signs glowing against the damp pavement. The silence grew heavy again, broken only by the hum of the engine. Vanessa filled it with shallow chatter, talking about wedding colors, flower arrangements, and photo shoots. She sprinkled her words with rehearsed laughter, carefully choosing phrases that painted her as a woman under pressure, a bride shouldering the weight of perfection. But Thomas heard the edge beneath it all, the disdain that slipped through when she thought he wasn't listening. At a red light, she glanced at him again, her smile rehearsed. "You really should think about what's easiest for everyone. Maybe the ceremony will be too much for you. All those steps, all that standing. We could always set up a chair for you in the back so you're comfortable." Thomas let the suggestion hang in the air. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He looked out at the rain streaking the windshield, each drop cutting a path through the glow of street lamps. He thought of the names on his guest list, the friends who had been dismissed as unworthy. And now here was Vanessa dismissing him too, reducing him to background scenery in his own son's life. The car jerked forward when the light turned green, Vanessa accelerating with more force than necessary. She talked about her parents' plans for a post-wedding brunch, about how Daniel's colleagues expected a level of elegance that couldn't be compromised. Every sentence carried an undertone. He was not part of the picture she was creating. He was an obstacle to be managed, explained away, eventually removed. When they pulled into the lot of a bridal boutique, the rain had thickened, drops tapping against the windshield like impatient fingers. Vanessa parked neatly, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and reapplied lipstick with practiced precision. Then she turned to him, her voice soft again. "I'll be quick. You can just wait here. I don't want you straining yourself." He nodded once slowly, as though grateful for her kindness. When she stepped out of the car, heels clicking across wet pavement, Thomas exhaled the breath he had been holding. He reached into his coat, touched the recorder, and replayed the last few minutes in his head. Her lie, her sudden feigned concern, her suggestion that he didn't belong up front, maybe didn't belong at all. Every piece was another stone in the foundation he was quietly building. He watched her disappear into the boutique umbrella, snapping open like a shield, and leaned back in the seat. The rain drummed harder, muting the noise of the city. He thought of Daniel again, of how his son had once clung to his hand crossing busy streets, trusting him completely. Now Daniel stood silently beside a woman who could nearly kill his father, and then twist the truth without flinching. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain steady him. He wasn't angry, not in the way Vanessa expected. Anger was fleeting. What he carried now was colder, sharper. He had spent a lifetime teaching that the past cannot be erased, that history always leaves a record. And tonight, so would he. The door to the boutique swung shut behind Vanessa, and Thomas sat in the quiet, cane across his lap, recorder humming in his pocket. He knew she thought she was safe inside her lies. What she didn't know was that every word was being preserved, every cruelty catalogued, every mask she wore, slipping one moment at a time. And when the time came, the world would hear exactly who she was. The restaurant had been transformed into a glittering stage, every corner draped in white linen and candlelight. Laughter clinked against glassware, polished and sharp, echoing under vaulted ceilings. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a rehearsal for the vows and promises that would bind Daniel and Vanessa together. But Thomas sat at the far end of the long table, cane resting by his chair, and felt the tension before the first toast was ever raised. He had lived long enough to recognize the tone of a room sharpened against him. Vanessa stood, her gown shimmering like liquid gold under the lights. She tapped her glass delicately, commanding silence, and every head turned as if gravity itself pulled toward her. Her smile was flawless, practiced the kind that drew applause before a single word left her lips. She began with warmth for her parents, praising their generosity, their sacrifices, their elegance. The crowd clapped eagerly, a chorus of approval. She moved on to her bridesmaids, her friends, even distant relatives who had flown in from out of state. Each was bathed in admiration. Each name was gilded with gratitude. Then her gaze shifted. Thomas felt it before he saw it. Her eyes landed on him, and the room followed, every fork lowered, every glass stilled. Her smile widened, but there was a sharpness in it that only he could truly feel. "And of course," she said, voice honeyed but cutting, "we cannot forget Daniel's father, Thomas." She paused, letting the weight of his name hang in the air. "You are a reminder of a simpler life, a time when things weren't so extravagant, when hard work meant everything." The room chuckled softly, unsure whether to clap. Thomas held her gaze, his face unreadable. She continued, her words smooth, cruel in their disguise. "We're so grateful you could be here with us tonight. It means so much to Daniel and me, especially since we know it wasn't possible for you to contribute financially to the wedding. Your presence truly is the greatest gift you could give." The applause came, then polite at first, then swelling as though the crowd had been instructed. The sound was knives against his skin. His hands stayed folded on the table, motionless. He could feel eyes on him, some pitying, some amused, some relieved that it wasn't them being dissected in public. But it wasn't Vanessa's words that pierced deepest. It was Daniel. His son lifted his glass, smiled weakly at the crowd, and toasted along. Not one word of protest, not one gesture to shield his father from humiliation. The toast became a weapon, and Daniel had wielded it by silence. Thomas lifted his own glass water, reflecting the candlelight like liquid steel. He raised it calmly, no smile, no words, only a slow acknowledgement. The crowd shifted confused and then moved on, conversations resuming, music swelling again. But for Thomas, time had slowed to a crawl. Each clap, each cheer, each laugh pressed down on him like weight he refused to bend beneath. The meal continued, courses arriving in waves, lobster bisque, filet mignon, desserts arranged like sculptures. Thomas tasted nothing. Every bite was ash. He listened to Vanessa gush about her parents' generosity, about Daniel's achievements, about the bright future ahead. All the while, his own life, his sacrifices, his decades of labor were reduced to a punchline, a relic, a man who brought nothing but presents to the table. He sat perfectly still, his cane by his leg, his back straight, his silence deliberate. He knew the performance wasn't over. The night had shown him exactly where everyone stood. Vanessa, proud and cruel in her control. Gregory and Elaine complicit in their smirks. Daniel silent, broken under her influence, and the rest of the crowd willing to clap along with whatever script they were handed. Thomas let the shame wash over him, let it cut deep, let it harden into something else. Not rage. Rage was fire that burned too fast, left only smoke. What he felt was colder, denser, the weight of stone settling into place. Resolve. As the dinner ended, Vanessa glided from table to table, her hand on Daniel's arm, her laughter trailing behind like perfume. She didn't look at Thomas again. She didn't need to. In her mind, she had already erased him, reduced him to a shadow in the room, a body at a table, nothing more. But Thomas walked out into the night with the recorder heavy in his pocket and the memory of applause still stinging in his ears. He looked up at the sky stars hidden behind city light and breathed deep. Every insult, every dismissal, every false smile was being catalogued one after another. The night had been a rehearsal, yes. Not for vows, not for promises, for something else entirely. And when the real performance came, Thomas would make sure the world remembered every word. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers that spilled gold across every polished surface. Music swelled, glasses clinked, and laughter rippled through the crowd like the surface of a lake touched by wind. The bride and groom twirled on the dance floor while guests cheered their smiles, fixed their eyes dazzled by the spectacle Vanessa had built brick by brick out of vanity. At the far end of the room, Thomas sat quietly, his cane resting beside his chair, his glass of water untouched. He had endured the rehearsal dinner humiliation, endured the sneers, endured his son's silence. Now the night had arrived, and with it the moment he had prepared for. When the toasts began, the microphone passed easily between Gregory Brooks with his booming voice and Elaine with her polished poise. Bridesmaids spoke with breathless laughter. Groomsmen stumbled through jokes rehearsed in bars. The applause rolled through the room in waves, each louder than the last. Then the MC turned toward Thomas. And now a few words from the father of the groom. The crowd quieted, expectation thick in the air. Thomas rose slowly, letting the cane support him, the weight of the years visible in his deliberate movements. Yet when he reached the microphone, his posture straightened, his eyes sharpened, and the room stilled. He began softly, his voice steady but rich with memory. Marriage is not about the flowers, or the chandeliers, or the size of the guest list. Marriage is about what remains when all of that fades. I learned that lesson from my late wife, Margaret. We built a life on love, on trust, on sacrifice. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. She isn't here to see this night, but I honor her memory with every breath I take. To Daniel, my son, I say this. Your mother loved you beyond words, and she would want to see you happy. Applause broke out, polite and brief, but Thomas did not smile. He let the sound fade, his expression shifting, his tone sharpening like a blade being drawn from a sheath. But happiness, he continued, his voice cutting through the silence, cannot be built on lies. It cannot survive on contempt or on the hollow promises of image and status. It cannot last when money matters more than respect. Murmurs rippled across the tables. Vanessa stiffened in her chair, her perfect smile frozen, her eyes narrowing. Thomas's gaze swept the room, steady and unyielding. I have listened. I have watched. I have been told I am a reminder of a simpler life. I have been laughed at for ordering steak. I have been dismissed as too frail, too poor, too small for this moment. My friends, my history, my very presence have been treated as inconveniences to be managed. He paused, letting the words sink, letting the silence grow heavy. But I am not here to beg for respect. I am here to show you the truth. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small recorder. The device gleamed under the lights, ordinary and unassuming, but in that moment it carried more weight than the glittering chandelier above. He pressed play. The ballroom filled with Vanessa's voice. First came the laughter mocking him for his steak order. Then her sharp words about his cane distracting her during the near accident. Her sneer about his guest list. Her dismissal of his presence as the only gift he could give. Each phrase poured into the room like poison, stripped of charm, stripped of disguise. Gasps rose from the tables. Some turned to look at Vanessa, others at Daniel, whose face had gone pale. Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is out of context," she snapped, her voice rising brittle, but the recording continued, cold and undeniable. Thomas waited until the last word faded, until the silence that followed became unbearable. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, almost gentle. "This is the woman you celebrate tonight. This is the woman who has mocked my life, my values, my love for my son. She married not for love, but for status, not for family, but for control. And if you applaud this union, you applaud her contempt." The room was frozen. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking out like sparks in dry grass. Vanessa's parents sat rigid, faces taut with fury. Daniel stood motionless, torn between the father who had raised him and the woman who had ensnared him. Thomas set the recorder down on the table, his hand steady. "My wedding gift," he said, his voice low but clear, "is not money, not property, not anything you can photograph for a magazine. My gift is truth, and truth cannot be polished away with champagne." He looked at Daniel, then eyes heavy with both disappointment and love. "Son, the choice is yours." But know this: love built on contempt is no love at all. It is a cage, and the bars will only grow tighter with time." For a moment, no one moved. The chandeliers glowed brighter, the silence pressing down like weight. Then a murmur swelled into a roar, guests whispering, some rising, some leaving. Vanessa shouted Daniel's name, her voice shrill, desperate. Daniel's hand trembled on his glass, his face ashen. Thomas did not wait for the decision. He placed the microphone gently back on the stand, straightened his back, and walked away from the table. The cane clicked softly against the floor, each step deliberate, echoing in the ballroom, heavy with shattered illusions. Behind him, the voices rose into chaos. Vanessa protesting guests, questioning Daniel, standing at the crossroads of loyalty and truth. But Thomas's face remained calm, his resolve colder than the winter wind. The night was not over. The truth had only begun to carve its path, and when the final blow came, it would leave nothing standing in its way. The chandeliers glowed like fire above the ballroom, their crystals scattering light across the polished floor where the bride and groom had just danced. Laughter filled the room, champagne flowed, and every detail gleamed with the perfection Vanessa demanded. Thomas sat quietly at his table, Cain leaning against his chair, glass of water before him untouched. He had endured her mockery at the rehearsal, endured the applause that turned his life into a punchline. Tonight he would no longer endure. When the MC called his name, the room hushed. Thomas rose slowly, letting the cane steady him. His shoulders stooped at first, then straightening as he reached the microphone. The silence deepened, the crowd expectant, their eyes fixed on the father of the groom. His voice began low and warm, steady as a river. He spoke of marriage as he had known it built, not on chandeliers or guest lists, but on faith and sacrifice. He told them of Margaret, his late wife, of the love that had anchored them through years of struggle, of how she would have wanted to see her son begin a new life filled with joy. For a moment the room softened, faces glowing with sympathy. Then his tone shifted, sharpened. His gaze swept the room, no longer gentle but piercing. "But happiness," he said, "cannot grow where there is contempt. It cannot survive when money, image, and status matter more than respect." A ripple of unease passed through the tables. Vanessa's smile froze, her fingers tightening around Daniel's arm. Thomas's voice cut like steel. "I have been called a reminder of a simpler life. I have been laughed at for the food I ordered, dismissed as too frail, too poor, too unworthy to stand among you. My friends, my history, my sacrifices mocked and erased." He paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. "But I am not here to beg for recognition. I am here to give you a gift." From his coat pocket he drew a small recorder. It gleamed under the chandelier light, plain, unremarkable, yet more dangerous than anything else in the room. He pressed play. The ballroom filled with Vanessa's voice, stripped of charm, stripped of the polish she wore in public. Her laughter sneering at his stake order, her cold accusation blaming his cane for her reckless driving, her disdain for his guest list, her final jab about how his presence was the only thing he could give. Each word spilled into the silence, each cruelty undeniable. Gasps broke across the room. Whispers rose, eyes turned to Vanessa, who stood rigid, her face pale beneath the flawless makeup. Daniel's color drained his glass, trembling in his hand. Vanessa snapped, her voice high, cracking. "This is twisted, taken out of context," but the recording continued, her own words, damning her with a precision no denial could undo. Thomas waited until the last echo faded. Then he spoke again, voice calm, cutting. "This is the truth of the woman you celebrate tonight. A woman who mocks loyalty, who sneers at sacrifice, who believes love is measured in dollars and appearances. You applaud her now, but ask yourselves, will you applaud her contempt tomorrow?" The crowd stirred, discomfort spreading like fire through dry grass. Gregory's face burned red. Elaine's lips pressed tight, but neither spoke. Vanessa's protests grew sharper, shriller, drowned by the weight of the recording still hanging in the air. Thomas set the recorder down, steady, deliberate. "My wedding gift," he said, "isn't money or property or a photograph to hang on a wall. My gift is truth, and truth cannot be dressed up in lace and roses." He turned his gaze to Daniel, the boy who had once clung to his hand, crossing streets, now a man staring into the wreckage of his own choices. "Son," he said quietly, but the microphone carried his words like thunder. "You must decide what kind of life you want to build. Love built on contempt is not love. It is a cage." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Then the room broke, voices, clashing, guests, whispering, some rising, some leaving. Vanessa shouted Daniel's name, her voice edged with desperation. Daniel stood frozen, his world unraveling, torn between the woman at his side and the father who had just pulled the curtain down. Thomas did not wait for an answer. He laid the microphone gently on the stand and walked away, cane tapping softly, each step measured and unhurried. Behind him the ballroom descended into chaos, Vanessa shrieking, guests murmuring, Daniel's silence louder than any voice. But Thomas's face was calm, carved with resolve. He had given them truth, and truth once revealed could not be buried again. The night was not finished. This was only the beginning of the reckoning still to come. The ballroom trembled under the weight of silence. Vanessa's protests cracked through the air, shrill and desperate, clawing for control as the recorder's final echoes faded into nothing. Guests stared, some whispering in shock, others unable to look away from the wreckage smoldering before them. Daniel stood at the center of it all, the glass still trembling in his hand, his face pale, his eyes darting between the father who had just torn the veil from the night and the bride who clung to his sleeve like a drowning woman. Thomas remained steady, standing near the microphone, his cane planted firmly on the polished floor. His expression was not triumphant, not cruel. It was resolute, carved from years of patience and sacrifice, lined with sorrow, but lit with an iron light no one in the room had seen before. He had said his piece, revealed the truth, and now he waited. Not for applause, not for validation, only for his son. Vanessa tightened her grip on Daniel's arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his jacket. She twisted everything, she hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. "It's manipulation, Daniel. He's jealous. He wants to ruin us." Her voice rose higher, cracking under its own weight, the polish peeling away to reveal raw panic. Daniel's chest heaved as though every breath was a battle. He looked at Vanessa, saw the desperation dripping from her words, and for the first time, he didn't flinch at the cracks in her mask. Then his gaze shifted to Thomas. His father stood alone, calm in the chaos, every insult endured, every wound carried, and still he stood. Daniel's eyes filled with something that looked like recognition of a man who had raised him on sweat and sacrifice, who had borne humiliation in silence, who had never once turned away when needed. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. The sound cut through the ballroom louder than any voice. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Vanessa jerked back, startled, her grip loosening. Daniel took a step forward, then another, moving toward his father. Tears welled his jaw, trembling, his composure collapsing under the weight of everything he had ignored, everything he had allowed. When he reached Thomas, the room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's voice broke as he spoke. "I'm sorry, Dad." Just 3 words, but they carried the force of years unsaid. His shoulders shook as he reached out, and Thomas, steady as stone, opened his arms. For the first time in years, father and son embraced, not as strangers separated by silence, but as men bound again by truth. Applause did not come. The ballroom was too fractured, too stunned. Some guests turned away, whispering viciously about the spectacle. Others watched with tears in their eyes, moved in spite of themselves. Vanessa's parents sat rigid, humiliated, their faces masks of fury. Vanessa herself stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without sound, her empire of perfection crumbling into dust before her. Thomas rested a hand on Daniel's shoulder, firm and steady, guiding him toward the edge of the stage. The cane tapped softly as they walked, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of finality. Each step away from the microphone was a step away from the cage Vanessa had built, away from the glittering emptiness she had promised. As they reached the ballroom doors, Vanessa's voice shrieked behind them, demanding, pleading, cursing in turn. But Daniel didn't look back. His hand gripped his father's arm as though afraid of letting go again. The doors opened, spilling them into the quiet hallway beyond, where the air was cooler, cleaner, untouched by the rot they had left behind. Thomas exhaled slowly, the first breath of freedom in years. He glanced at Daniel, whose eyes were red but clearer than they had been in months. Neither spoke at first. Words were too small for what had just broken and what had just been reclaimed. Finally, Thomas said, his voice low and steady, "It's not too late, son." Daniel nodded, his lips trembling, tears still slipping down his face. "I should have seen it. I let her." His voice faltered. Thomas stopped him with a gentle squeeze of his shoulder. "You see now, that's enough." They walked together down the corridor, the faint hum of chaos muffled behind the doors. Outside, the night was waiting, cool and sharp, the city lights flickering like distant beacons. Daniel inhaled deeply, the air filling his lungs as though he were breathing freely for the first time. In that moment, it wasn't about the money, the inheritance, or even the humiliation they had endured. It was about blood rediscovering blood, about a father and son who had been fractured but not destroyed. Thomas knew the road ahead would not be simple. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. But as they stepped out into the night side by side, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Behind them, the ballroom would unravel into scandal, whispers would spread, reputations would rot. But none of that mattered now. For the first time in a long time, Thomas was not walking alone. And Daniel, his son reclaimed from the glittering trap of vanity, was finally walking with him. The night was theirs, and what lay ahead would be built not on contempt or deception, but on the raw, unshakable bond of a father and son who had found each other again. And though the world behind them burned, the future before them glowed with the possibility of something real, something lasting, something worth every scar. Life has a way of testing what truly matters. In this story, a father endured humiliation, silence, and betrayal, only to discover that truth has more power than appearances, and that love cannot survive when it is built on lies. For older audiences, the lesson resonates deeply. Your worth is not measured by how much money you give or how glamorous your life may appear, but by the integrity you hold and the legacy of respect you pass on. Even when others dismiss your sacrifices or try to erase your history, dignity will always outlast vanity. The bond between parent and child can bend, even break, but when truth is revealed, reconciliation remains possible. It is a reminder that we must never stay silent in the face of disrespect, and that sometimes patience and wisdom are the sharpest tools of all. For anyone who has felt unseen or undervalued, take heart. The truth may take time, but it always rises. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of the strength we carry even in silence.